Okay, so let's start from the very beginning when you open a file in InDesign. So you can either open a file that's on your desktop or wherever you've saved it, or you can create a new file just like the other documents. So let's open a new file, and you're going to see this panel with all this stuff on it, but it's really very simple. The images it's showing you are first sizes that I've used recently. This is saved. I haven't really saved any except for the 8.5 by 11. These are all standard print sizes: letter, legal, tabloid, and half. And there's even more than that. There's business cards and even compact discs, however useful that is. You'll also see templates here shown. Just keep in mind a couple things. One, these are not free. These are some of them say free. And then there's some templates here at the bottom. Keep in mind with these that what's being offered here as a template is being offered wherever this software is at. So you wouldn't want a client to see their design that you did for them came from this template assortment. So everybody is hiring you for one-of-a-kind designs. However, it's a really good way to learn things, and it's a good way to start a project. So I don't use those, but I could see how they'd be useful. Then over here on the right, you can name your file here if you want. And then we're going to choose 8.5 by 11. You can choose to have 11 inches wide or 8 inches wide, the format. This facing pages, the only time you would choose that is if you're doing a brochure where there's like a cover or a first page and then a spread and then a spread and then a back page. When you want your pages all lined up together, you would uncheck that. So you can put in here the amount of pages you want. I just want one. Primary text frame we'll deal with later. It's a very kind of complicated way of placing text for an entire book when you don't know how many pages you're going to need. You allow the text to just determine how many pages are in the document. Both columns and margins are just guides. They are nothing that will show up in the print. So when you break your page into columns, it will give you guides for those columns, and the gutter is the space in between. So you use this a lot for magazines, newspapers, and brochures, layout, so it can be helpful, but keep in mind you can change this within the document. You don't have to get this all sorted out when you set it up. This is a margin, again another guide. This is giving you 1/2 inch of space and a little line to show you where that is. And then bleed and slug we're going to cover endlessly in this class, but just to give you the quick overview, bleed is the area beyond the page where images and objects should go to if they're going to be trimmed off the page. Slug is just an empty area around the layout that you can put things in, like notes for the printer or fold lines or something like that. Okay, so we've got a new file. Let's talk about the interface a little bit. I want to point out some things to you. So just so you know when I'm referring to these, this at the very top is called the application bar, and every one of these is a pull-out menu, organized pretty well. So everything you can do for a file, edits you can make, things that affect the layout, everything related to type. Object is anything related to an object that you've placed in there. Tables we'll get into, viewing, your plugins, window, all your panels are on your window, and then of course help. So that's your application bar. It's a lot like that in the other Creative Cloud software. And then on the left, you actually have a tool panel, and yours might look a little different. It might be 2 columns wide or might be slightly different, but this is the way I have mine set up. In the first 3 or 4 things are really about selection. So you have the direct selection, modifying the page, gap tool, and content creator. These are all about the overall page. And then you have the type and some drawing tools. So type, lines, the pen tool. These are boxes, but also the rectangle frame tool for placing objects. Following that are ways you can modify them. So scissors, you can crop and erase. And then we have the gradient feather and the gradient swatch tool, which we'll get into later, and the eyedropper. And then the last 2 things are for viewing. So this uses your hand tool, you move around the page, and then the zoom tool. So that's basically what's in there. The 2 colors represent the fill and the stroke. So it will show you whatever's in there. It'll be contextual to whatever color you're using. Something you should know about your workspace. So if you look up here in the corner, I have this set on Essentials. But if I set it on Essentials Classic, I actually get another control panel up here at the top, which I like. I like having that up there because I like to see whatever's going on. So if I work with type, so if I make a type box, everything in that control panel is what I can do with type. So this is basically an extended character panel and then the paragraph panel. So it's contextual, meaning that it reflects whatever you're working on, which is very useful. Now if I create an object like a box, everything in that control panel is telling me what I can do with it. I can rotate it, I can resize it, stroke it, put a fill on it, center it, align it, all kinds of things like that. So I find that useful. So you might be able to use Essentials Classic rather than Essentials. There's a couple others here. They usually will load up all of the panels for that. So an interactive for PDF loads up all these interactive features, buttons, and things like that. So what I usually do is I either work in Essentials Classic, because like I said, it's the only one that gives you that control panel at the top, which I like. The other thing you can do that you'll really like is you can create your own workspace. So I have my own workspace on here, and it's just named by me. MDV. It's not very different than the Essentials Classic, but I work with the Properties panel always open, whether I'm in Illustrator or in InDesign. This is a contextual panel that helps me. So if I put a box here, you can see it gives me all, just like the top control panel, but this time it's in a panel, and it goes all the way down. It also tells me right away what I've chosen. Like it says I can convert this shape, arrange it, text to image and things like that. I can control it this way. If I put a type box, then everything shows up here, my paragraph styles, my type information, centering, indenting, and everything like that. So that's how I like to have things arranged, but you might want it differently. I also have these panels. So each of these represents one panel, and all the panels are listed under Window. If you're ever thinking, how'd she get to that panel? I don't have that panel. It's under Window, always. I like to keep the Properties panel open. I like the Links panel because it tells me about my images. Swatches tells me about color. Character styles, I don't always open those. I could get rid of that. And then paragraph styles I like putting in there. So I like having all these docked, and the other ones here on the side. I like it with the control panel up at top. If you arrange your workspace and you want to save it as your own workspace, you just say new workspace. You put your name. Do you want to capture the panel locations, meaning those panels, how I have mine docked? And you'll gradually build up this kind of preference for how to work in InDesign. But these are generally the ones I like to have open. And whether you want the menu customization. So you can create your own workspace or you can use one of these presets. So the most important thing to know about InDesign is that basically most of what you're working with is a container and an object, and that is a little bit differently than Illustrator and even Photoshop. So let's start with type. When you choose the type tool, the first thing you have to do is you actually have to drag out a box, and it gives you the cursor inside that box. Then you can type out your word, in this case, type. When I highlight the word, I can affect the size, and you can see they have all these automatic drop downs. So I can make it 48 point, 72 point, and there are actually a lot of shortcuts and easier ways to do this, but I'm going to show you that as the semester goes on. So I've got the word type. It's sitting up here in the corner, and this is the actual box that the type is sitting in, and these are separate. So the type, no matter how big I make it, and I'm using a shortcut of Shift Command and the forward arrow, the box doesn't change. Only the type sitting in there changes. And in fact, if I make that box too small, I'll get this. It doesn't have room for the type, so it just doesn't show it, and you'll get this little plus sign. You can affect the type inside the box when you highlight it. So when you highlight it, I can change the fill color to red. I could even put a stroke on it. I can make it bigger. I can make it all caps. I can make it, right now it's left aligned, but I could make it centered, and that's within the square. It's centered within the square. So those are all changes that I'm making to the type itself. The container that the type is in, I can also change. So I could make that container black. I could make that container centered to the page. And notice how all of these options come up in the Properties panel. That's why it's so useful to have that. It's a lot better than working like this with all these panels. I see this a lot with students, and it's like, it's very hard to work that way. And I'm just going to reset MDV so I have it the way I like it again. So everything is contextual, whether you're working on the type. If I highlight it, all these things can be done to type. I can even click this size up like that. I can make it aligned right within the box. And there's even more I can do in here. I can do spacing above and below. I can make it into bullets. I can change the hyphenation. So you can see all these things for the type itself. Once you do the box, I can align it centered. And this box is a compound object. So you can also change the box itself. I can rotate it by hovering here in the corner, rotating it that way. And I'm just hovering right at the very corner, and when I see that come up, I move it. You could also change the box shape. So if I select on this with the direct selection tool, I can grab this corner, for example, and make the box go to here. I can make the box go over here with the type in it. So those are the differences between the container that holds the type and the type itself, and how you select and change each of those. Now let's talk about a container that you would use for images. So I've put this rectangle frame tool on here, and I'm going to go to File, Place, and I'm going to place an image in here. And I've got this image of Michael Jordan's shoes. Now with the container that I've made, which is the outer box, relative to the size of this image, that's how much of it shows. So it's almost like a clipping mask in Illustrator. It controls how much of the image you see. If I double click, now I don't have the container, I actually have the image. And if you look, you can see that the image itself can be changed as small or as large as you want it, but the container will restrict the size. So if my container, let's say that my container was a 4" by 4" square, that's how much of the shoes you would see. And then when I double click on the container, I have access to the image itself. And do you see how the bounding box of the image? So now there's a couple of things I can do with the image itself that doesn't affect the container. I can move the image around, so that changes the crop. I could go bigger by either holding the corner and the shift key. It's really important when you're resizing anything that you hold the shift key. So if you don't, you're going to have images that look like this. When you're resizing, just hold the shift key. You can also change things that are on the container itself. So now if I double click, I'm on the container. You can always tell by the anchors. There's that yellow and the blue. This is when you're in the container. So I could go over here to the stroke, and I could put a stroke on that. I could tilt the whole thing. I could make it larger. And again, because it's a compound shape, I could also grab just one corner with the direct selection tool and change the shape itself. That's all done on the container. Now when I click back to the image, you can see that the image changed with the angle of the container, but I could actually change this image even within the box. So it's kind of nice in InDesign that you don't have to make clipping masks. You just make a container. Always, you have to place your images inside a container, and your type also has to be inside a type container. But there's freedom to do things with the container that don't affect the image itself. So that's the basis of what InDesign is. One more thing I want to show you is the preview. When I'm looking at this, especially like here's the image, it shows the bounding box of the image. And once you get a lot of things on this page, it's a lot to look at, and it's hard to kind of decide if your layout is working. These are my margins that you see out here, the guide for margins. So here's what I do is I just hit W. When you hit W, it looks like a printed page, and you can still work on it. So I could still either move this shape around the container, or I could move the image within the container. All the same functions, but now I don't have to look at that margin and all that. And when I hit W, again, I'm back to the working space that has the margins and everything that I need for reference. Okay, so those are the main things that you need to know to get started working on an InDesign file. Everything that I've shown you briefly, we will go into in depth as we work with it.